Test 1, 2. Are we there? Good to see all of you. Thank you for coming. Lord bless you on a beautiful day. Well, it gets beautiful anyway once the rain stops, right?
Every day is beautiful.
Every day is beautiful. This is a great time of year. But good to see all of you. I came tonight. Hey, Jesus, what's up? I came tonight and I keep looking for our next series, and for some reason I keep sucked back into this idea of these weird stories in the Old Testament. And one of them, I'm so sad. The sister that asked this question, she isn't here. But, you know, one of the biggest weird stories in the Old Testament, if you've never read it, is the book of Job. Some people mispronounce it as Job. No, it's actually Job. It's actually Yov in Hebrew. But have you ever read the book of Job? Can you explain to me the book of Job?
Yeah.
Tell me.
So he goes through a whole bunch of trials and tribulations and near-death experiences.
Yeah.
And he has faith in the Lord. His faith in the Lord is so great that he knows that there's a reason for it.
Awesome. That's a great explanation. Yes, a test of faith against all adversity. What he said, Donna, was he goes through all these experiences and near-death experiences and all that. And at the end of the day, it's what? He finds out that there's a reason for it? Yeah. What was the reason? To show him to have faith. Okay. Ah. The devil was trying to get him to curse God. Yeah. Curse God, and even his wife tries to get him to curse God. They both tell him. So sometimes the devil sounded like his wife, which happens in the post-exile stories. That's a post-exile guy, that guy. I think he's the guy responsible for throwing Eve under the bus, all those. Well, I got into it so much, just reading it and studying it and reading everything I could, and I almost thought about making it a series, but I don't know. Maybe we'll see how tonight goes. If you want to spend, I don't know if I want to spend a bunch of weeks in the book of Job, but Job is an amazing book. Some people don't like it at all because it really is, it's very long, by the way. It's 42 chapters long, and that's a lot of poetry for anybody to read. And it gets very dark. And so even just the first part of the story, if you've never read it, is a story about, that just kind of paints a picture of Satan, by the way. I'll get to that in just a bit, but there's only 3 passages in the Hebrew Bible that mention the name Satan. And one of them is this one, and another one is in Chronicles, which is post-exile, and the third one, I believe I'm just blanking. I'll come back to it. But the third one is in Zechariah, which is also post-exile, which Satan comes before the Lord to accuse the high priest Joshua. And the Lord defends him just like he defends Job. And so for those reasons, that Easter egg in and of itself isn't enough. But for a bunch of reasons, it seems like at least some of the story of Job is late. And so what's really confusing about it is the setting of it. It would be like if I sat down to tell you a story about Abraham Lincoln. So the setting of it, the surroundings and the pastoral lifestyle and all that, it sounds like it's from way back in the time of Abraham. So actually, when I left Bible college, that was my theory, is that this is one of the oldest stories. Well, the story's very old, but it was actually told later. The second thing is, a lot of people, the majority of scholars would look at it, and even though they don't all have the same theory, it seems like some parts of the book of Job were written at different stages. We've talked about layers in other books over the years. And there's a middle section that starts in chapter 3. And when you read the first 2 chapters, it's all this very, almost like a, it's almost told like a story. It's got patterns and people repeat the same phrases. And it really, to me, sounds more like a parable than like a historical story. Like, here's the parable of Job. So Jesus told parables in the New Testament. We know that the Bible does this. Sometimes he says, and then Jesus told them this parable. And sometimes it doesn't announce it. Sometimes he just starts telling it. The story of the prodigal son, is that true or not? Is that a parable or is that a true story? There was a man and he was walking back from Jericho and he was pushed, and then first the priest came by, and then, it's all this kind of it seems like it's told in a pattern that to me, once again, I say, it doesn't really matter. It could have been a real guy, but if it wasn't, the story is still powerful because of what it talks about. And so several church fathers, and I'm one of them, I think the story of Job is a parable. And so I don't get too caught up into its explanation of what angels do and how Yahweh interacts with the Satan. By the way, there's a definite article before his name, just like there is in Zechariah. So it's like saying the Mike. So this may be earlier than sometime between the Old and the New Testament. Satan, which means adversary, became an actual, like a proper title. And so it evolved into that. The idea that we have, that Satan is the chief of the fallen angels. You don't really have that in this story. So for a lot of reasons, this story kind of confuses me, and a lot of people do. They'll say, what is going on in the beginning of the book of Job? I thought Satan was cast out of heaven. How come he can just come and go? Because those two things don't line up. And my answer is because those are from completely different eras. What changed wasn't God. What changed was the way we talked about him. And so I just want to start off and read this story, can we? Let's start off before I talk it to death, and it's not like, so let's read Job chapter 1. And if you're really ambitious, you can go through verse 10 of chapter 2, because it's kind of all a big long story. It's kind of like two scenes out of the same story. And so why don't we just take our time and read it from whatever translation you got. Of course, I'm going to have my own translation in a minute, but Job chapter 1 and 2. Let's read these. And by the way, can I interrupt you for just a second? Usually I say, look for things that seem strange, or questions you have, or concerns that you have. One of the things that I want you to listen to and take your time is, what's the point of that? Like, if it tells you that he has a lot of sheep and camels, why is that important? All right. Nothing in this story is on accident or just because it happened that way. So remember, these are prophetic stories. So this is a prophetic parable. Okay, so what's the point of that part? Okay, anyway. You done yet? What do you think? What? You hope you don't have a day like that? I used to tell that to people. I'd say, boy, have you ever had a day like Job? And people go, yeah, boy. I said, you have? You have? The scraping the boils with the potsherd, you've had one of those days? That's pretty bad. I used to ask, my dad we used to do devotionals in my family when we were growing up, sitting in the living room, and we read through this story, and I was mortified. I had questions the first time I heard this story. None of this makes sense to me. And I made the mistake of asking Dad, Father, what are boils? You don't want to know. So why was he sitting in the ashes? Because that's the only place that was soft enough. Oh, man. Doesn't really say, other than he's just sitting there. All right, what parts of this seem odd to anybody? Any part of it seem like perfectly normal thing to happen? It seems like God is kind of goading Satan, like he's kind of putting Job out there like a worm on a hook. It seems like he's kind of goading him. Yeah, there's some real. This is why I said it's better for me to look at this as a parable that has another goal. It's setting up the rest of the book of Job rather than reading this as because if this is just actually how it happens, now I have more questions. And what does the Lord seem like in this? What is it? His character, his personality. What do you learn about this? First of all, he's proud of Job, but then he kind of leaves him out there like that goat in Jurassic Park, right? Oh, so that's another way of saying it, is you could say he kind of had faith in him. He knew he was going to hold up against it. And so maybe he's trying to teach Satan a lesson. Okay, that's great. Donna?
It seemed interesting when it said, one day the angels came to present themselves to the Lord.
Yeah.
Which I never really think about that.
So that's a... Yeah. And it doesn't even say angels. That's an NIV. NIV does a lot of smoothing stuff out. I have been a long lover of NIV. It was my first Bible. And the more I learn about languages, I'm using it less and less. It's still a great translation, but it says sons of God. So you remember, like in Genesis 6, the sons of God and the daughters of men. It says the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh. And so that's a very rare thing. Now, Psalm 82 is another psalm that we think is kind of like an old psalm, but so the old pantheons, the religion before the religion of the Bible, the Mesopotamians had a rich religious life. They had a pantheon of gods, so did the Egyptians. So the Sumerians turned into the Babylonians, and the Babylonians had all of their gods. Every city had another god. And then the Canaanites that lived in Israel before the Bible was written, there was a very rich Canaanite mythology and many gods, the chief of whom was called El, and he had sons and daughters. All of those, their religious systems had like at least 4 or 5 levels. So there was the chief creator gods, so El and his consort was Asherah. And one of the next levels, like one of the princes was Baal-Hadad, who's the Baal in the old northern stories that Elijah fights against, and that Ahab and Jezebel talked Ahab into worshiping. And so there are some passages in the Bible, some poems that are so old, they kind of use some of the language from the old Canaanite times. And so Psalm 82 starts off with saying God, Elohim sits amongst the gods and he passes judgment. So it's still like, it paints the God of Israel still like he's sitting up there and the lesser gods are his council and he's presiding over them. And I read some of those old Mesopotamian myths where all the lesser ones, they have to come and ask permission from El to do this or that. And so kind of the relationship of these. So NIV just says, well, let's just call them angels. But the book of Job calls them the sons of God, which when you translate that, so El is the main God, the sons of God in Canaanite mythology were the Elohim, that plural word, that by the time we get into the Hebrew Bible, Elohim is a plural word that's used just for the name of God. And so that's kind of how all those words morph together. But what's really fascinating to me, and I love these kind of stories that give me questions, is because it's almost, this parable is almost set up like a parable from the old Canaanite mythology. It's not very contemporary. It's like going back in the olden days. And then it uses the word, NIV smooths this out too. It calls him Satan with a capital S, and it probably should be the Satan. And so the Satan is an adversary. Satan is like, I guess in a spiritual sense, he's the prosecuting attorney. So in this scenario, he's kind of the bad guy, but it's kind of not that yet. Later on, by the time the New Testament comes along, he's the enemy of our souls. He's the accuser. He's the tempter. He's doing all of those things. And this kind, this is an old enough story where their version of Satan can still kind of come and go from the presence of the Lord. And that doesn't really ring up with the Satan being cast out of heaven thing, right? So all that means is that I'm not looking for this story necessarily to give me the hard, fast theology about who the devil is and how he works or who Satan is. I just kind of want to listen to the story. And what does this story tell him? So as far as the world that this narrator lives in, whether it's fictitious or not, is a story where Satan comes and goes, and sometimes Yahweh will let him do things. And so it's very puzzling, but yeah. What were you going to say, brother?
You just hit on it.
Okay.
Part is, Satan can move throughout the earth on his own,
Yeah.
but he has to work within restrictions of God.
Yes. Yeah, he has to be submitted. He's only allowed to do what God lets him do. Yeah. So
Can't steal my camels unless God gives me.
yeah, I can't steal your camels. I thought he was talking about his cigarettes for a second, but to steal his camels. So yeah, camels is another weird thing. That's one thing one of my professors told me. So that limits the age of the story to some extent because camels weren't domesticated until 1200 BC. And I had a question about that. I said, what? I said, yeah. What do you mean they weren't domesticated? Do you mean before that there wasn't somebody that saw this big giant thing bouncing through the desert with big flat feet that don't sink in the sand and could go miles and miles and didn't dare somebody to get up and see if he could ride it? But that's the working theory, is that about 1200 is when camels were domesticated. So maybe be after that. Charles. Yeah, all those children.
It just seems like one step further than God would ever do
Yeah,
to anybody that trusted and called out to his name.
the kids get fridged. You know that phrase? It's from the comic books. Nobody knows that phrase. Have you ever noticed in how many of the superhero movies, the girlfriend or the wife, or even the spy movies, how many times in movies the girlfriend or the wife gets killed at the beginning? So the only reason she's in the story is to give the guy reason to go and take revenge. Every revenge movie you've ever seen, I could probably list off about 40 of them. And it comes from some comic book. I forget who the comic book character is, but the girlfriend gets killed and put into a fridge. And so now that's commonly known as fridging. Where the woman, so the kids in the story, and it's like, oh, that's terrible, that's horrible, all of your kids. But at the end of the book, it gets better, Charles, because at the end of the book, he gets 10 more kids. So doesn't that make it all better? If you've lost a child, you can always have more. No, I know. But according to this version, this storyteller, that's the good ending of the story. In fact, he got twice as much. Yeah, okay, there you go. It ended up good because he got back twice as much at the end. And it's just like, no, that does not make it better. So I love reading these stories. I've kind of strange like that. I like the stories that push the envelope of, now wait a second, this doesn't fit with the rest of it, because then I want to dig and find out more. I want to say, so what is this? So we've talked about the layers of when different stories were written in the Bible. The oldest from the north, then the southern stories, which is really, for me, this is the pinnacle of the Old Testament. And then there were some during Josiah's time in the exile, and then the last layer was the priestly layer. Almost everything in the book of Job is from priestly or later, even though the story was written to sound like it's really old. So it would be like me sitting down and writing a story, about William of Wallace, So we know, you ever see Braveheart? When does Braveheart take place? 1400s? Nope, 1996. No, see, I asked this question. You're right, I don't even know if it's 1996, but it's in the 90s, right? So the question, there's a difference between when the setting of the story takes place and when the story was written or told. And so there are several reasons, before I get into it, several reasons why many people, myself included, think now, even though the story is from old, and by the way, the original version of the story may have been very old, passed down verbally. So you can always have that. It could have been a very old story, but now it's being retold. Like if I was to write a book, or write a fiction book or make a movie about Robin Hood, right? The story's old, but I'm telling it to you fresh. So how fresh? Well, there are several things in the Hebrew of the story and of the poetry that there are several Aramaisms. So Aramaic became the official language of the Babylonian Empire somewhere around 500 BC. And so there are several Aramaic phrases, and even the Hebrew is really weird. I'm not good enough to hear it all. I just can study and translate the words, but the Hebrew is very, and here's the best guess from real Hebrew scholars. They say it's almost like whoever was writing it in Hebrew, but that wasn't their first language. So they were writing a Hebrew story, even Hebrew poetry, but there are just some weird phrases and some weird things that you wouldn't say it like that in Hebrew. So it has a bunch of it may be one of the most unique books in the entire Bible. So it has those Aramaisms. Plus, from about chapter 3 through about 40, the last section, this is the epilogue, the beginning part, the story that sets up the poem. The rest of those chapters are all poetry. It completely changes the genre, and you can read it, even in my NIV Bible, it changes even how it's not just prose storytelling, but it's verse and verse and verse, and it uses couplets, and it uses iambic, I call it iambic trimeter. Remember in school they taught you iambic pentameter, it means it has 5 feet, not necessarily 5 syllables, but it has a beat like that, da 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 da. So in the poetry section, in starting chapter 3, there's a lot of 4s and 3s, and it's very poetic. Hey, Jesus, you had a question? Oh, totally goats. And listen, I know you said if you didn't hear, I got to repeat some of these things so that people that are watching online know what the question was. I have Pastor, unless somebody wants to use the microphone or work the microphone, or I'll just do it this way. Yeah, Jesus says I have a hard time with it because it makes, in this story, that Satan and Yahweh are almost like equals. When he entices, he actually says it, Jesus, flat out. God says, and you're the one who enticed me to go after him and destroy him without purpose. And the word entice means like to seduce or try, like Satan tricked. So Yahweh in the story says, you're the one who tricked me. So it's just like, man, the writer of this story had a very unique Very unique take on it. So a couple other reasons we think that it's late. The name Satan I mentioned, it's only used 3 times in the Hebrew Bible, is more of a Persian idea. So in the older Hebrew Bible, God was responsible for everything. God brought life and death. God brought rain and sunshine. It was all God. There was just God. After the exile, the idea became more of separating those 2 roles. So God does the good things, and it's Satan that does the bad things. And so, in Persian way of thinking, there was more of a duality to things. So there's actually a story in the Bible where the 3rd place that the name Satan is used, and actually in that place it doesn't have a "the" in front of it, is when David takes up a census. And in the old version, in Samuel, it says, and then the Lord put it on David's heart to take up a census. And then he was judged for it. It was evil, one of those places that he shouldn't have done it. When Chronicles, what's told after the exile, when it retells that story, it says, and then Satan put it in his heart to take up a sentence. So it's the same exact story, only now it's being told different. So what am I saying? That there was an evolution or a change and a growth in the theology. So it's not God that changes, but how we talk about him changes, and how they talked about him in the Bible. And so this is a very interesting snapshot of a moment in time, almost between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when they had a little kind of a theology that doesn't fit either one, about who Satan is and how he works and where evil comes from. Jesus. Like parts in Job where it sounds like he is almost cursing God?
But if you go back to like how you explained, you go further back in that time, you just said like they thought everything came from God, and they separated to where the good came from God and the bad came from the devil.
Right.
So we're part of that culture, and so if we read it, what am I trying to say? Like me reading this from what I know, it almost seems like he's already did what he was not, what God said he wouldn't do.
Yeah. It makes it sound like he's God's agent, and yeah, it's confusing. I wouldn't give this to just a new believer and say, here, this explains how Satan works, because it's confusing. It's one of those that's worthy of a Wednesday night study, right? It's what we do, is we kind of come on Wednesday nights and kind of try to tackle some of the weird places in the Bible. But so not only is the language a little bit different, but the theology is very Persian in the story. So now there's a frame around the picture. The frame is the prologue and the epilogue, the beginning and then the last part of chapter 42, which is an epilogue. The middle section of it, the nougaty center, if it was a chocolate bar, is philosophical poetry about why do righteous people or innocent people suffer. And it's brilliant. It's some of the most brilliant, and it's more advanced than the story. And so here's the really question, and no 2 scholars will agree about it. Well, maybe 2 will. But my best guess is that poetry section, all of the stuff that starts in Job, and then Job opened his mouth, and you have this debate between Job and 3 of his friends, and then it's his friend, and then Job, and then a friend, and then Job, and then friend, and Job, and then it starts over, and then the last time, the Zophar, the 3rd friend, doesn't speak, but Elihu, this other guy comes. There's a younger friend that comes and speaks, gives about 3 speeches. And then at the very end, God shows up and he just asks questions. He doesn't answer any of the questions. He doesn't address it. He doesn't give them the answer. And then he gets his sheet back, but it never mentions Elihu at the end. For all of that, it's almost like and then chapter 28 is a completely unrelated list of proverbs about wisdom. And so Could it have been written by the same person? Yeah, one person can write all those different genres, but it seems like there could be as many as maybe 4 different sources of this that were all put together in one. And so, but the story, the debates in Job, even though it's written in a completely different meter and language and there's other things, it sounds like what they're debating about is what happened in the story. And so if they didn't know about the story, then what are they debating about? It could have been just a big, long debate. And then somebody found this and framed it with a story or with a parable that set up for the dialogue to happen. Charles?
If you read the first 2 chapters, 3 chapters, and then you read the rest of it,
Yeah.
the rest of it almost substantiates the claim that it's a parable, because it's even when Job's just being hammered into the ground,
Yeah.
and his wife is trying to get him to turn.
Yeah, his wife is almost one of the tormentors, right?
And he just keeps saying the same thing. He just keeps saying, it's going to be okay. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. And in the end, it's okay.
Yeah.
So it's almost like one of Jesus's parables, saying, you know what? When things get bad, trust in God.
Yes.
Trust in God, it'll be fine in the end.
And that was the point of it. Trust in God and it'll be fine in the end. And that's the point of the storyteller, of the parable teller. And so I separate between the parables and the dialogues. I think they're from different sources. But which one comes first? Some people think that the story is kind of almost childlike and very primitive, and so it must have been older, and I just don't know. Some of the weirdest spots in the Old Testament, to me, were added after the exile. Those are the weird parts. I mean, so they march around Jericho and the walls fall, and then he says, and then go kill every man, woman, child, and all the cats and dogs and everybody. And I'm like, that was later from the post-exile period. So my theory is that what the dialogues discuss is this problem, is that if Job is a righteous person, then how come he's suffering? And all of Job's friends, their assumption is, you must have done something. Who, being innocent, has ever suffered? And so they're kind of challenged. The book of Job challenges the idea of retributive justice, that everything happens for a reason, and that if you're good, good things happen to you, and if you're bad, bad things happen to you. And so if good things are happening, it's because you're a good person, and if bad things are happening, it's because you're a bad person. It's retribution. And that's the way it works. Any question? Okay, then you say, well, what about Job? Or what about you? You know? So we have this notion, none of us are perfect, none of us are righteous. You know, it makes you want to ask the question. It's God himself that said, have you considered my servant Job? He's Tamim and Yashar. He's blameless and upright. And so he fears God and shuns evil. That's an Old Testament way of saying he's actually a perfect example of what God is looking for in people. Are you with me? And so this story is set up to ask this very important theological question. If that's true, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, what if I was to tell you a parable about the most righteous person that has ever walked the planet, who had the most terrible thing happen to him? So these are the data points I want you to put into your calculator now, all right? Now go and debate it. How do you make sense of that? And no, you can't change it. You can't change Job's righteousness. You can't. That's the anchor point. And you can't change the fact that he suffered. You can't say, well, it was only a flesh wound, right? He suffered terribly, right? So the most righteous person that ever lived and the worst things that happened. Now go debate it. How is that possible for those two things to exist? And I think the trauma that precipitated this was the exile in Babylon. I think this is why it's very Persian and why there's a Satan in the story. So think about, this story is not just a random guy, but Job is kind of a stand-in for the nation of Israel and what happened to them. Even so much so, now, was the nation of Israel innocent? No. But that's what the prophets were saying. The prophets became like Job's friends, and they're saying the reason you ended up being destroyed and the roof fell in on you because the temple was literally burned, and all of your property was taken away, and you lost all of a whole generation. The reason that happened to you, and the prophet said, it's because of your sin. Read Ezekiel, read Jeremiah. They are just over and over and over said, the reason this happened to you is because you sinned. And so somebody with a brilliant mind sat down and wrote this dialogue between a suffering righteous person and his friends to question whether or not that actually makes sense. Does that actually work to blame the victim? Or isn't there sometimes that the guy can actually be righteous? Job defends his innocence the whole time. And, the people, by the way, people have got their PhDs on this question of could Job have actually been righteous or whatever. But according to the narrative, that's the problem. That's what's setting it up. We're going to make this, all right? So here's the math problem I want you to work out, Steve. Steve was a math teacher, right? He's a righteous person, and he suffered the worst possible fate. All right. Go and tell me what the philosophy is. And it launches into some of the most beautiful essay and painful poetry debating that. The book of Job debates itself. This is why it's frustrating. Did you know the Bible debates itself? People that want to say, oh, it just all tells one story. I said, you haven't read it. There are places that definitely do, like this story right here. And so it's important for that dialogue. Job was the basis of a book written by a guy named Rabbi Harold Kushner, who back in the 80s wrote a famous book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he lost his daughter, and he's a rabbi. And it was a huge crisis of faith. And he had to go back and rethink a lot of his theology. How do you make it true that God is all-powerful and that he's a good God, and yet still sometimes good people suffer? And he worked that through. It's a great book if you've never read it. And a lot of his answers to the question was that we need to stop asking the why question and ask what? How can I help? That Job's question when he says, why is this happening to me, wasn't a question, it was a cry for help and for mercy. And he has a lot of great practical advice on how to help people that have gone through bad things. But let me just tell you, as someone that has prayed with and consoled people that have had miscarriages, you can always have another is not a helpful thing. It doesn't help to say, so anyway, Job is a great primer on 101 things that really sound logical but don't help. It's a great one for that. If you read it like that, not that we're supposed to live by every word that Job and his friends say, but to listen to that debate and listen to how nonsensical it is. I like to take quotes. Job says, if I was in your place, my words would try to bring you comfort. He's very sarcastic like that. There's a lot of sarcasm. Like he goes, my friends are as reliable as intermittent streams. Just all these great interactions. He says, if I was in your place, I could talk like that too. It's really easy to say, well, you must have done something wrong when you're the one when you're not the one that's suffering. And so I think Job is an important book. So the story sets up the dialogues. And somebody had a question?
Got a comment on it.
Tell me.
So it almost seems like, so as much as Job suffered and everything, and then he came out the other side with all, with the abundance of everything, it's almost like the whole story of being born again preemptively.
Yeah.
And then Jesus went through the suffering.
It's like being born again. Some people see in Elihu, who's the fourth friend, that seems like a later addition, even though it's kind of in the same style. Some people see him as a precursor or like a Christ-like figure. I think they're trying to kind of Christianize the text. It's a little too early for that. But yeah, there are parables. Oh, one of the favorite lines that just really ties into it. And he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and in my flesh I will see him. That doesn't get, I've used that, I did that as a series title when I preached through this passage one time. But anyway, all right. I tell you, one other famous thing, if you're inspired to go and read the book of Job, so I believe that the first 2 chapters are a parable that was written to set up the dialogues. The meat of Job is the dialogues. And then the prologue, I think, was added. I think they were added later, but I don't know. I think they were added later because it seems like it's setting it up. And during the dialogues, he never really talks about he never mentions Satan again. He never mentions his family or losing his children or losing the camels. He does. And listen what he says. Job's friend's conclusion is that it must be Job's fault. Job blames God the whole time. And he plays, and it's very, it's not sanitized. This is why I think the person who wrote the middle part of Job was not the same person that wrote the parable. Because the person that wrote the parable very much believes in retributive justice, that it's even. He does. He starts off by saying, Job was the righteous man, so that's why he had all these cattle and these children, right? So if you do the right thing, you're gonna have this stuff. And then it says, and he never sinned with his words, and he never cursed God. He does during the dialogues. He never says he curses him, but he blames God. He blames God. He says, why are you picking on someone that doesn't deserve it? Why don't you go pick on someone your own size? Why don't you just kill me, go all the way? Why did you let me be born at all? He argues and yells at God throughout the whole thing. And Job's conclusion is that it's God's fault. He blames God. And so, anyway, somebody's got to be to blame. It's either Job or it's God, or you never hear him talk about the devil. So in the middle section, he never mentions 2 names. In the middle section, which is all the poetic dialogues that are all in this meter, the name Satan is never mentioned at all. And neither is the name Yahweh. So that's a big deal. So all throughout this, in the first 2 chapters, his name is Yahweh. But in the whole middle section, the name of Yahweh is never used. But it does use an old word for God. It's Eloah. It's a form of Elohim, Eloah, and there's a place in Habakkuk that it says that it changes, and it's an old Edomite. It says Eloah came from Teman. And so Teman is down by Edom, like the south of the Dead Sea, down in the southern country. So right on the border of the old nation of Edom and Arabia. And so that's the setting of this story. So it could be that this whole big long poem about the righteous suffering and how that makes sense and how do we make sense of it, that it had its origin in the southern country. So I get that for just saying, when you read it in English, it just says God, but in the first 2 chapters, God is spelled Elohim, and starting in chapter 3, it's Eloah. And so those kind of just let us, I don't know. You want to read through it together? I mean, not the whole book. Here's the story. There was a man who lived in the land of Uz. That's how you say it. Job was his name, and he was an unblemished and upright man, and he feared God and he shunned evil. So this is setting up, it's almost like it's setting up a math problem. My favorite calculus, I took calculus when I was a senior in high school, and I remember one test. This is one test. It was one problem long. It took us the entire hour to do it. But it says if a man is, calculus is just like all the other math added up and with time. And so a man is 6 feet tall and he walks past the lamppost that's 20 feet tall at such and such a speed. If he's walking this fast, at what rate is his shadow growing? That was the problem. We had to use all these formulas. It was 2 pages long to figure that out. All right. So this to me is like a word problem. This is setting up a story. Let me set you up this parable. All right. Just in case somebody raises their hand and goes, yeah, but he probably messed up sometimes. And it says, no, God himself said he's blameless and upright. He fears God and shuns evil. I don't know about you, but if I could do those 4 things, I'd be doing pretty good. All right? So don't think in the story. Why is the narrator making that point, and he makes it twice? God says it twice about him. He's trying to remind the reader that are about ready to read all of these debates about good and evil, is don't let it seep into your mind that it was probably Job who was the problem. He wasn't. And then it says, and he was in possession of 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. By the way, even in the ancient world, that's a lot of sheep. And that's a lot of camels. That really is. That's almost like, at this point in the story, people that lived in that era, they kind of shook their head and go, oh, we're telling stories now. Okay? This is a story. Don't get too caught up in the detail of it. Listen to what the parable is trying to say. Like when Jesus says a man went out to scatter seed, and some of it fell on the rocky part of the road. Some of it fell on the wayside. You know, you don't raise your hand and ask the question, was it a real story? Doesn't matter. He's telling you he's teaching you through a story. All right? Okay. And he had, and his service was very great. That means he had a lot of servants. And he was a great man among the people of the East. And his sons went out and had a feast, and the house of each on their own day, and they invited their sisters to eat and to drink with them. And Molly says, well, that was his kids' fault because they were eating and drinking. In the story, it's in the text itself, it's not necessarily faulting that the feast was not the problem. You could say, well, they were drinking wine, and that's why it came down in their head. But in this narrative story, that's not the point of it. And it was, that's one of his favorite, he starts off, each one of these sections is, and it was. Vayahi. And it was, when days of feasting had passed, that Job sent and sanctified them. And he rose up early in the morning, and he offered burnt offerings for one of them. For Job said, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And this Job did every day. And so, notice, Job wasn't praying because they had been feasting. He says, what if in all their feasting, and he didn't even say that they did. He said, what if just in case one of them has cursed God in their hearts? Because that's the sin of this story, is not to curse God. What if they did? I'm going to even cover my bases, and every day, whether they ask for it or not, I'm going to go make sacrifices, and I'm going to pray for them and sanctify them. Why is that part of the story? It's building up, right? Just in case somebody says, well, it was the kid's fault. Maybe it wasn't Job's sin that caused the calamity, but maybe he was being punished for his kids. And just like, and that's one of the things Ezekiel, after the exile, he says, no longer will it be said in Israel, the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. From now on, the soul that sins shall die. And so Ezekiel confronts that notion that was evidently floating around. So the storyteller is just he's just imagining, some of you might think that he's gonna, that maybe it was the kid's fault, and he says, no, even if the kids had done something wrong, Job had it covered. So not only was Job a righteous and an upright man in himself, but he even went over and above and interceded for his kids. Lest any of you are going to come back and say it was Job's fault, right? Was it Job's fault? No, it can't be. Remember, that's the first part of the problem. You got to remember, okay, the part of the story is, let me tell you the story about the most righteous person you ever lived and the worst thing that happened to him. Lest you ever think, well, how righteous do you have to be to keep bad things from happening? How righteous is it? You know, maybe the problem is you're a little bit righteous, but you're not all the way righteous. How righteous do you have to be, Mike? How righteous do you have to be? Can you be more righteous than Job? No, you can't. No. The way it's told, unless you're just not listening to the narrator is telling you can't be more righteous than this guy. And so let's go back and work the math differently then and stop blaming ourselves. There are some things that happen in life that are our fault. There are plenty of those, right? So let's work on those ones, but stop blaming ourselves for the stuff that isn't ours. Friends, I got to tell you, I've walked through with people, even just in the last few years, I mentioned miscarriages or who've lost their loved ones ahead of time. Or I had one of my son's best friends, they aren't believers, but their son committed suicide while I was teaching right here on a Wednesday night, and I got a call and I had to leave and go up to the house. And they knew some religion from their background, but most of my time with them, and I didn't even ask them this, most of my time with them was spent ministering to them that this was not your fault. This is not your fault, because that's just something naturally that we do. And so the book of Job is trying to reach down and minister to that notion in us that blames ourselves. And it's not that any of us, does anybody here think we're perfect? I don't know, any of us do, right? But this is kind of going, this whole book was written to address this thing. And it was written to the people in exile. But we can learn a lot from it. So every day he did it, never left off a day. And it was when the day came for the sons of God to present themselves before Yahweh, that the Satan also came in their midst. And Yahweh said to the Satan, from where did you come? Okay, once again, doesn't God know everything? All right. So this is one of those stories. This is all very high poetry. It just builds it up. From where did you come? All right, first of all, you mean Satan can go places where you don't know where he is? Don't get too caught up in the details. All right? Listen to what the overall picture is. And the Satan said to Yahweh, he said, from roaming the earth and walking around in it. And then Yahweh said to Satan, have you taken into your heart about my servant Job? So heart and mind are the same thing in Hebrew, just by context. I translated it literally, it means the heart, but the heart is where you do your thinking too. We separate the brain from the heart, like this is my emotions and this is my intellect. In Hebrew, just the heart. So have you taken it into your heart? It's have you considered? Have you thought about? Have you thought about Job? For there's no one like him on the earth, a man who is unblemished and upright, who fears God and shuns evil. So now even Yahweh agrees with the narrator, lest anybody blames him again. But the Satan replied to Yahweh and he said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not hedged him about around his household and around all that is around all that he is his around him? Have you not blessed the work of the hands and prospered his possessions in the land? I like this word hedged. I don't know how that's what the word means, kind of wrapped around a hedge. But I love the book that was written a few years back, Is the Devil Afraid of Shrubbery? He's coming out to get you, right? But as soon as he sees hedges, he stops. I can't get over that. Oh, that's too far. So he must be afraid of shrubbery, according to this. It's an old Hebrewism that is just, you put a protective wall around him. So there's a force field around him. He says, but now stretch forth your hand and touch all that is his. Will he not curse to your face? So Yahweh said to Satan, behold, all that is his is in your hands. I hate that line. Only you shall not stretch forth your hand upon him. And then Satan went out from the presence of Yahweh. And so all of these things that don't fit my New Testament theology, I thought evil couldn't live in the presence of Yahweh. Well, evidently Satan can come and go. This is an old parable that's trying to set up the debate about why good things happen. And so it's a parable about the most righteous person that ever lived and had the worst thing. He's more righteous than you can ever be, and he suffered a greater tragedy than you could ever suffer. Right? These are the extremes. Setting up the debate, why do bad things happen to good people? And it paints the corner. And so the point of the story is the most extremes in both directions. All right? Just in case you ever get back and start blaming yourself again. I've had people that came and they had a miscarriage and they said, I was just thinking, when we had our first two, we used to pray a lot more. And I just said, oh man, I could hear it. I could hear Job coming in. And you would not believe how many times I've spent just saying, no, brother. I said, listen, of course you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. But I've known you people for years, and you love Jesus, and you love your kids, and you're good people. So Rabbi Kirshner says there's two things that every sufferer needs to hear. Two things. Is number one is you're a really good person. And number two is it's not your fault. That's powerful. It's powerful. And especially, when we come from a Reformed theology that we focus more on the fact that we're all fallen and we're all sinners saved by grace and stuff, there's a point to that notion too, right? There's a point in us staying humble and always being reliant on the grace of God. All right, that's a different point. When someone's going through a terrible tragedy, that's not the time to lay that on them. Well, maybe you should have prayed more, or maybe you should have been more holy. They just need to know. I've sat with people that were through painful divorces that were against their will. In Oregon, we have no-fault divorce, so you don't even have to have a reason. You can just be divorced. And sat down with lunch and I said, I got to tell you something. You didn't deserve this. And the guy just within tears, he says, thank you for saying that, because he'd just been beating himself up. And so, anyway, if nothing else, you get that out. And it's not for me. It's by Rabbi Kirshner. And so, by the way, I saw a video of him when I was in college, going to Bible college. I really think it changed my life. I think I've been preaching some of his philosophy and using it ever since. Because it really made sense to me. And it kept me, by the way, through all the bad stuff, any of the pain that's happened in my life since then. I've never once been motivated to blame God for it. I never blamed God. As far as I'm concerned, God is the one that does all the good stuff in my life. I'll blame it on human frailty, mistakes, just human nature. And even human nature, how can you, people are people, But I've never thought, oh man, God, why did you allow that person to get a cancer? Or why did you allow this, that? Or why did you allow this accident or something? I don't blame him for that kind of stuff. And part of it was working through this book. Well, and it was the day, and then it was the day that his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of the older brother. And a messenger came and said, the oxen were plowing and the jennies were feeding beside them. You know what a jenny is? It's a female donkey. King James uses a different word. I just changed it. It says, and a messenger came, and then a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen, oh, sorry, I repeated it. And then the Sabians came down and took them away. Sabians are from the area of Arabia. So that's kind of one anchor point. And the Assyrians mentioned them. And they killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and only I escaped to tell you. And before he's done talking, another guy runs up. This is a great one, Tom. No two people talk at the same time. As soon as the second guy comes up, the first one disappears. And while this one was still speaking, another one came and said, the fire of God, which is Elohim, the fire of Elohim fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And only I escaped alone to tell you. And so some people say, well, maybe fire of God means lightning. It just says fire of God. So I think, we want to try to make it into a real story. In this story, you're supposed to see that it was supernatural fire from the heavens that came and destroyed those poor sheep and the servants. Are you with me? Okay. And while this one was still speaking, another one came and, While this one is still speaking, another one came and said, the Chaldeans made up 3 bands, and they fell upon the camels, and they took them away. And then they killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and only I escaped to tell you. So everyone says this. When you hear people keep repeating that same poetic line every time, does this sound like a news article, or does this sound like a parable? They're in a numbered order, and they say the exact same words over it. You're supposed to get into this rhythm, and it's building, isn't it? By the way, has Job even had a chance to breathe yet? He hasn't even had a chance to say anything. Before he's through processing what one guy just said happened to his stuff, another guy runs up and says, and he starts telling another story. It's just horrific. To me, it's brilliant storytelling. How it just keeps that momentum, and it's like, man, just as soon as I think it can't get any worse, oh yes it can. One of the lessons of Job is no matter how bad things get, they can always get worse. So don't ever say to yourself, well, honey, I guess it can't get any worse than this. Oh, yes, it can. There's other stuff. This was one of, by the way, this has actually cheered me up, retranslating and reading this story again, because I've forgotten how terrible it is. And then it just gets worse and worse. And while this one was still speaking, another one came up and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of the oldest brother, and behold, a great wind came from beyond the wilderness. And it doesn't say it, but the word wind, remember from the Valley of Dry Bones, the word wind is ruach, which also means spirit or breath. So it doesn't say as much, but you get the impression that it was a supernatural wind. And I think it's interesting too, by the way, in this first story, it never mentions Satan doing any of these things. But in their theology, even though he's not directly related, it's Satan that's kind of, you know what I mean? And so this is kind of, we have that notion, don't we? When things are happening, we blame it on him. And it smote the four corners of the house, and it fell on the youth, and they died. And I alone, and only I escaped alone to tell you. Then Job arose, and he tore his cloak, and he shaved his head, and he fell down on the ground and worshiped. He uses that word worship. Tearing his cloak and putting ashes on their head as their ancient customs of mourning. So that's what that meant. And then he said, one of the most beautiful, we even have a worship song that uses this word, one of the most profound, maybe as beautiful or at least equal to the end of the book of Habakkuk. Though there are no cattle in the stalls and no figs, no fruit on the fig trees and stuff, even if I have nothing else to eat, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I think the book of Habakkuk and the book of Job are from the same era. They're very much a similar theme of faithfulness even when things aren't going well. You know, it's great for you to come and praise the Lord when things are going good, but what are you going to do when it's not going well? Isn't that the message of this story? So I'm not worried about the details and stuff. There's an Easter egg in the previous one that I forgot to mention. Oh, is it one? The Chaldeans. So the Chaldeans are not unknown to us. The Chaldeans are not a nation. They're not a people group. They were a dynasty. And they ruled from, I forget, Nabopolassar, the first one from the low 700s, so from right around the time of Hezekiah. And Nebuchadnezzar II, who came and destroyed and tore down the temple, he was the third in the line of the Chaldeans. And the last one was in 539 when the Persians conquered them in the book of Daniel. And so we know there's a terminus point. The Chaldeans, this couldn't have been a really old story because the Chaldeans were mainly in the 7th century, 7th to the 6th century. And so it's just a little Easter egg that this band of raiding party, one of the curses is that the Chaldeans came in and stole all the goods. Well, the Chaldeans, there were only 4, maybe 5 kings in that dynasty before it was over. And they're in the history books. We know who the Chaldeans were. So anyways. And then he said, naked I came from the womb of my mother, and naked I shall return to there. The NIV says I shall depart. That doesn't really make sense to me, but the idea is that I came in naked and I'm going to go out naked. And Yahweh has given and Yahweh has taken. Blessed be, that should be the name of Yahweh. In all this, Job did not sin and did not foolishly give blame to God. It doesn't say blame, but it says he did not foolishly give to God. And so the intention, I think, of that phrase is that he didn't put it on God. He didn't blame God for it. But then when you get to chapter 3, like Jesus says, you get into there, he does too blame God. And so I think they're from 2 different traditions. I think this parable was set up to set up the whole dialogues. And it was when the day came for the sons of God to present themselves. So this is all a repeat, an exact same thing. Except Yahweh said to Satan, have you taken to heart about my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a man who is unblemished and upright, who fears God and shuns evil. And he still holds fast to his integrity or his innocence. He still holds fast to it, though you enticed me against him to destroy him without cause. And so even Yahweh in the story says, he blames Satan. He goes, you enticed me to. So Yahweh, according to this guy, can be tricked, and Yahweh destroys people without cause. I don't believe these are theological points that we're supposed to take for today. So just in case nobody heard it, the Lord does not just destroy people without cause. He doesn't just come and knock the four walls of our house down. This is a parable that's trying to set up the philosophical debate of how good do you have to be before you aren't the cause of bad things. But the Satan replied to the Yahweh and said, skin for skin. For all a man has, he will give for his own life. But now stretch forth your hand and touch to his bone and to his flesh, and then will he not curse you to your face? So Yahweh said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. So the Satan went out from the presence of Yahweh and struck Job with horrible sores, and from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. The worst possible thing. You lost all your possessions, you lost your family, you lost your health. Yes, I said, never say it can't get any worse than this. It can. Be grateful. Doesn't this make you just want to go give your wife a hug when you get home and say, honey, we have it so good. Aren't you glad we're not Job? And so then he says, and then he took a potsherd to scrape, my favorite part when I was a kid, to scrape himself, and he sat in the midst of the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still cling to your integrity? Curse God and die. The first line she quotes from Yahweh, that he's still clinging to his integrity. And the second line she quotes from Satan. He says, curse God and die. It's interesting, by the way. Later on, the word curse is actually bless. It's really strange. I haven't seen that before. The word is bless. Bless God and die. But it doesn't make sense. The only explanation I could get from the Hebrew experts is that it was sometimes you could use that same word to mean the opposite. I'll have to take their word for it. It says bless, but we're supposed to translate it curse. Starting in chapter 3, it uses a different word for curse. And so, anyway. But he said to her, are you not speaking as a foolish woman speaks? Shall we receive from God the good and not also the evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And he says this. So now in this story too, both good and evil come from the Lord. Good and evil, by the way, kind of just means bad things and good things. Good fortune and bad fortune. Evil doesn't necessarily mean to be spiritual evil. It's just anything bad. And so should we not be faithful in the good seasons as well as the bad? So there really is. Do you get the moral of the parable? Don't get too caught up that this is giving us sound theology about Satan and about the way God moves and stuff like that. This is not a theological story. This is a story that is meant to pose to us the problem of how are we going to react? And so for a generation that had just been cast into exile or that was in exile, this is one of those stories about how should we respond. All right, maybe it was our fault, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel said, but even if we were a basically righteous nation that honored the Lord, what are we going to do with the fact that we've lost everything? How are we going to respond? Are we going to turn away and blame God, or are we going to praise him even still? Anybody else? What are the questions you have about Job? I don't think I want to do a series on Job. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to another weird story. But I haven't come up with a better series, so I'm just going to find some more weird stories. Is that all right? There's more where those came from. Any other thoughts about Job? Kind of exhausted everything you ever wanted to know about Job, and then a couple things you didn't know you wanted to know.
I just remember my mom saying as a kid, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out.
I brought you into this world, and I will take you out of this world. Yeah.
That was the first thing I thought of.
You came in naked, and you're going out naked, and that's all there is to it. You got nothing else? I didn't bring anything in this world, and I'm not going to take it out either. There's no U-Hauls behind a hearse. Yeah, so that's a great story. I hope it's a good one. Oh, I got something. I have my own personal observation that I never heard anybody else said. The brilliance. So I'm not going to tell you what to read, but if you want to, now that you know that this story was a setup for the debates, It's some of the most amazing philosophy. There are people who say, I don't really agree with the Bible. And I said, that's a silly thing to say. That's like walking into the library and saying, I disagree with the library. I said, which part of it? So there are debates in the Bible. The Bible debates itself. And Job and Job's friends, so picture this. I think that whole section was written by one person. But when he changes persons and argues for the other side because it uses a lot of the same kind of language and the same kind of meter and everything, but he changes and gets into the skin of the other guy and he argues with everything that he's got. Like all of those great arguments, and then he jumps back into Job's skin and argues and debates against himself. It's really brilliant. It's brilliant writing. The only thing that I could think of is years ago, I was watching an interview with all of the voice actors from The Simpsons, and they were just admiring and being amazed at Mel Blanc. Anybody remember Mel Blanc? He did all of the Looney Tunes voices. He had like 300 characters. I mean, he was Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Elmer Fudd, Tweety Bird, Foghorn Leghorn. All of those were one guy. He could do dialects. He could do all of those characters with an accent. He was just absolutely a genius. And they said one of the most amazing things we've ever heard, these voice characters, right? The guy that does Homer and all those guys. And they said, there's this one cartoon, one of my favorites. Actually, I think there's two versions of it. It's called Duck Season, Rabbit Season, where Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny are both trying to trick Elmer Fudd into shooting the other one. So they say it's rabbit season, and he changes the sign to say it's duck season. And then at one point, Daffy Duck dresses up like Bugs Bunny with long ears, and Bugs Bunny dresses up like Daffy Duck, and they're both trying to trick him. And so then Mel Blanc does the voice of Daffy pretending to be Bugs, and then Bugs pretending to be Daffy. And they said, and you can tell the difference. And they were just because they were talking about all the character voices they do, and they said, could you do that? Could you do, Homer pretending to be Bart, or, vice versa, without messing him up? And they just said, nah, just a genius. So I heard that, and I said, that to me is how brilliant the book of Job is. The book of Job isn't four people debating. The book of Job is one person exploring that debate back and forth. And you take some of his friends, you can take it out of context, and there's some beautiful passages in there. And so it just reminds me that when people are hurting, it's not always that they need beautiful philosophy. Sometimes they just need someone to help them cry, So anyway, book of Job, that's the weird story. And the one lady that asked for it isn't here, so oh well. Okay, well, I'll wrap up then. Lord, we thank you for your word tonight. We thank you for Job. Lord, if Job was a real person, not just a parable, I hope he's okay. But Lord, we just thank you. Lord, I thank you that you don't treat people like that. You're a kind and a gracious God, that you look after us, that you love us, that you're on our side, that you're pulling for us. And I just pray, Lord God, that we could learn from books like this to learn how to talk to our friends that are going through hard things. We give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Lord bless you. Thanks for coming.